Okay, so we have two participants that just raised their hand. Why don't we start with that? Don't think I can actually see. So we have Vladimir and Clement. Vladimir, do you want to go first? And Clement, maybe I'll take those two and then we can move to the chat where others can think of their ideas. And our panelists are also welcome to grill me. And I should also say that at this point, I'm going to invite my other co-authors to also join me. We thought it was impractical to have a team of 7 or 10 people present today, but I'm not letting you all off the hot seat for answering questions. So Vladimir, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Colleagues, are you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through just fine.
That's great. Hello. So let me introduce myself first of all. I'm focused on China and Central Asia for more than 20 years. So thank you for such unique report. I'm also impressed, first of all, by your social part because it's really a good job. And what I could add, I think your social dimension miss two very crucial elements. First of all, so-called shuttle trade. This shuttle trade has not only economic dimension, it also has social dimension in case of Central Asian states. So we have people who traveling to China to buy the products and then resell it with products in Central Asian countries. So it's a very crucial dimension. And second dimension, second sector, it's tourism sector. It's represented by visits of citizens of China to Central Asian countries. Of course, these two sectors are dead in COVID time, but anyway, we have to pay attention to these two very important sectors. So regarding this social dimension, and thank you very much. Regarding others dimensions, so I think the economic dimension is most weakest because it's economic such economics, most economic sector such trade. So you didn't mention trade activities, so it's crucial. Plus financial activities of China didn't separate it on investments activities and credit activities. So as we know, a lot of Chinese financial activities represented by credits activities. So a lot of Chinese financial resources are credits. We have to remember these facts.
Thank you, Vladimir.
Another element, enterprises. You have mentioned a lot of Chinese projects in Central Asia and in general, but a very interesting fact for you. About 5,000 Chinese enterprises only in Central Asia. 5,000. Plus, regarding investments and financial resources.
Vladimir,
about 100 billions of dollars.
May I interrupt, Vladimir? I'm
yes.
sorry. I've been grabbing some notes, really good insights. I do want to make sure we have time for the other people.
Anyway, thank you very much for your research.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great.
Sam, I was going to say maybe we could collect the questions and then you can. Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we have Clement and Najam next. So Clement and then Najam, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, I'm just a private citizen. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you. But in reading, I get The Economist, and reading some of these conditions that China imposes on their economic investments are pretty severe. Is that correct? In terms of if they do not pay back their debts, China tends to then take over the enterprise or whatever they've invested in. That's all.
Thanks so much, Clement. Okay, so so far we've got kind of some questions about what's included in the economic dimension, what's missed, and the social dimension from the first speaker, and then Clement wanting to know a little bit more about the conditions. Why don't we go next to Najam? Najam, are you still there?
Najam, sorry, Sam, I'm not seeing.
Okay, they were there. Okay, so that's fine. Balihar, would you like to go next?
Hey, hi, thank you, Samantha, for the report. Really insightful. I suppose the question that I would like to ask you is you talked about how Chinese investment is debt financed. I suppose in that regard, China is no different to any other country around the world that finances projects through debt of one form or another, or various conditionalities. Whether countries do it directly or whether they do it through international finance institutions like the World Bank or IMF or the European Bank of Development and Reconstruction. So I was really just wondered if you could say a bit more of why you think the financial diplomacy or debt diplomacy, I don't think you used that word, debt diplomacy, but I think you used financial diplomacy. Why you think that's more of a particular issue for China as opposed to other countries that also use finance. And also I suspect, I mean, I don't need to tell you, Samantha, the history of IMF and the World Bank in relation to Latin America and how debt was used to undertake very stringent reforms and even in some cases to oust democratically elected governments. Thank you.
Excellent questions. Really appreciate that, Ballyhart. Why don't we take one more? I think that's probably about 4 I can handle in my brain at one time. And then we can come back to others. So Joan, please, do you want to go next? Or sorry, Joanne.
Oh, Joanne, your microphone is turned on.
Perhaps while we're waiting for that to get figured out, we could go to Babar. If I'm mispronouncing your names, please forgive me.
It's all right. You've mentioned that you're hoping this research will lay a groundwork for future generations of research, as you said. What direction do you think, please excuse me, what direction should this research take, or what would you suggest could be done with your data set?
Excellent questions. Chris, if you're comfortable, we'll go ahead and answer those, and then we'll see if we have time for another round. And team, feel free to chime in. I think some of these are a little bit on the outer edges of the report, so I can tackle them first if you like, and then you guys can supplement. So let me start with Ballyhar's question, which is a good one, kind of comparing the financial diplomacy versus other foreign powers and international organizations. I think you're absolutely right. I was presenting this morning and I said, you know, for several of these tools, they are not new in several respects. You know, aid has been around for a long time. Foreign powers don't use this just to be generous to other countries. They do this to influence other countries and build their reputations. That's certainly one of the reasons. That's true whether you're the US or Japan or China. You know, and also the international organizations, the multilaterals like the World Bank and the IMF are certainly important players. What's different and similar, and this kind of also lends itself to Clement's question, I think I can answer both of them in tandem. So I think that there are some similarities and some differences that are useful to keep in mind. So one is that when you look at the different types of instruments that states use, and that is really the focus of this report, is kind of looking at finance as an element of public diplomacy that states undertake to cultivate relationships with foreign leaders and publics. Many states use aid, many states use date. One of the differences is the ratio. So if you look at the U.S. or a country that reports into the OECD's creditor reporting system, which is kind of like an international reporting regime that creates standards. The vast majority of the financing that these countries typically provide via these channels is in the form of aid, because it must meet certain bars of concessionality. So it can be grants, it can be no or low interest loans. China does not report into the OECD CRS. They also give what we would consider to be conventional aid. So they do give grants, they do give no and low interest loans, but they also give a lot of debt-based instruments that are notable and distinct in a couple of respects. One is the scale. The percentage of the financing that is in the form of debt is much, much larger than what you see from other foreign powers. Secondly, the terms of these deals are actually a lot more, the terms are not unique to China, but they're more common in the private sector than what you would see in terms of state-directed financing for public diplomacy. And so the terms that China uses tends to be much more market-based, collateralized lending that you don't often see with other foreign powers. Also, the terms of these projects tend to be very opaque in terms of the lack of public disclosure. So that is one of the major challenges, I think, with China and trying to reconcile that. Another difference, a lot of people will ask me to compare how China does financing versus a World Bank or IMF or the US. And one of the things I say is that both have strings attached, but they have different strings attached. So the US and the World Bank and your IMFs, and you alluded to this, I think, Clement, or it might have been Ballyhar, sorry, for morphing now. You both alluded to this idea that like a World Bank puts conditionalities on aid. So that means that in order to supply aid or assistance to a country's government, you're saying, okay, here are the things I want you to do before I'm willing to give you this. So often it's things like anti-corruption or democratic norms, or it might be labor protections or environmental safeguards that in order to get access to this financing, you have to say, hey, I'm going to make reforms that are going to move me forward in this regard. China doesn't typically do that in most of its lending, but that doesn't mean it doesn't come with its own version of strings attached. And that is what I would kind of call more the quid pro quo guanxi kind of obligation. It's loose, it's fuzzy, it may come in future, you're not exactly sure in what form. It might be, curbing back recognition of Taiwan, or it might be, supporting China in the UN, or pushing through a free trade agreement rather quickly. You're not exactly sure, it's not upfront, but it's still there. And so I think, it's not a matter of one is bad and one is good. I think that both come with considerations for countries to think about. I think in terms of the question that the last person raised about what direction should this research take, I mean, that's hopefully something I'd love to hear the panel discussion kind of think and reflect on as well. A few things that come to mind for me, though, that were mentioned here and talked about this morning when I presented, is the intersection between the private sector and the public sector. And this also goes to Vladimir's point. And perhaps I didn't do as much of a preamble because I wanted to be short and concise with my remarks, but the bounds of, and this is because I'm a researcher, I get to do this, I get to set the bounds of my research. And so the bounds of our research here was public diplomacy. And so typically, although there's not a lot of agreement on what public diplomacy is, and we spent the first few reports trying to nail down what is included in public diplomacy and found that we had to make some decisions. Typically, that doesn't tend to include things like trade or foreign direct investment that are heavily or much more heavily emphasizing the private sector. Whereas we did feel like we could include financial diplomacy, which was state directed, highly visible, very much emphasizing those sectors and areas that were kind of built around stoking popular goodwill and goodwill with leaders, stadiums in cities and humanitarian assistance delivered and the like. And so, but at the same time, I recognize that in our world today, certainly in the way that China goes about public diplomacy, but also in the way that increasingly, I think foreign powers to compete with China may need to think about doing more, is intersecting and thinking about all of the levers of society working together in synergy and in synchronicity. So thinking more about, okay, what does it look like for the state to work with the private sector when appropriate? What does it look like to engage civil society in a meaningful way? And so I think understanding the different roles that these actors might play could be an interesting one. I had a question about public diplomacy in the post-COVID-19 era this morning, which I thought was a really interesting one. We started to tackle that a little bit with one of the questions we asked the leaders, but just the timing of it was still kind of in the thick of it. It's still kind of too early to tell. So I think that'd be an interesting one, especially because some scholars are viewing this now as being a critical juncture for who is going to ascend to international and regional leadership in this stage. I think I took a pass at answering many of the questions. I think, Justin, do you want to go ahead and chime in with additions?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a bit for some additional avenues for research to follow up on this, just because there are so many directions that one could go here, I think. And kind of two big things that really stand out for me is that while we do have this great resource with the Gallup World Poll to analyze data on perceptions, and we've got our listening to leader surveys that AidData runs, I would personally be very curious to know more about, for a given project that China implements, how much does some ordinary person know about that individual project? And then if an ordinary person is actually aware of that, how much is that really moving the needle in terms of their perceptions or approval of Chinese engagement in their area? I think that kind of interest is something that could be great fodder for things like surveys or interviews that are, say, going into communities and asking people about specific projects. That kind of granularity, I think, would be one really great direction to move in. The other area that I'd be really interested to see more would be thinking through some of the networks of relationships that exist within the financial projects that China is paying for. So in addition to just a Chinese entity giving money or some kind of resource to a community locally, money is often passing through the hands of various actors. There are some countries that we are aware of where maybe not all of the money that is intended to reach a final endpoint actually gets there. So kind of as some funds might be mismanaged in some cases, or just for various reasons not go to their intended destination, there could be a lot of interest in following up on kind of all the different kinds of actors that money is passing through. There are some efforts that we have internally that are going to be building on that interest, but there's plenty of room in that area for others to become active. So I'll stop there, but I think that it's a great question to think about various avenues that people could follow up on this work with.
Chris, how do we want to handle time? Shall I turn it back to you, or?
Yeah, well, because I know that Julie, Nargis, and Liz all have their hands up. I was just going to quickly say regarding surveys. So a colleague at KIMEP, Alma Kudabayeva, she and I did a survey at KIMEP, and what we found is that very few KIMEP students are aware of BRI projects. So to answer, I just wanted to add that. So Julie, yeah, so because it's 8:05. So Julie, Nargis, and then Liz, and then we can get into the discussion. So Julie?
Thank you. In fact, I just want to add a bit of what you say. I also similarly did surveys in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, asking if the younger generation know anything about the BRI. And the large majority of them in those countries say no. And in fact, in this process, because we distribute a questionnaire, and other students, in the end, they write down, like if they have any comment, and most of them told me they don't even understand what is the BRI. So they don't know how to answer that question. Yeah, and I think this is, the project sounds really promising, and you have more resources than I have before. So I look forward to kind of filling this gap, like the perception, not just from the elite, but perhaps from the public in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Nargis?
Yes, thank you very much. And well, they might not know about BRI, but definitely know about China, and that there is more of China in the country, in the region. Well, as a panelist, I had the privilege of seeing the takeaways from the report. And first of all, I want to say big thank you to AidData team for this, and I'm very much looking forward to the report and the previous reports. I think I will express the collective sentiment of gratitude to AidData in general for for having your data sets and kind of making our research possible. And I thought in this report, particularly interesting for me was your emphasis on the subnational subnational community, subnational level, and definitely like on provinces, districts, and definitely they can be more kind of in-depth and research on kind of factors behind it, whether these are really kind of powers of corridor, like corridors of power, how these things happen. Because you mentioned Atirau, for example, district in Kazakhstan, and the fact that it is an area where kind of energy is produced, and that's why it is important. So it sort of makes sense. But then, how do you explain the kind of the choice of Osh, right, in Kyrgyzstan as another area where that receives a lot of attention and aid from China? So it'll be really interesting to kind of dig more in this direction. I also very much appreciated what you did on kind of with your research on social networks, connections, and accounts, and clearly there isn't much discourse power as of now, that China has in the region. And I had some questions, if I may. I wanted to raise them here. One is the question related to kind of this connection between presence, engagement, and influence and power. The title of your report is Corridors of Power, How Beijing Uses Economic Social Network Ties to Exert Influence Along the Silk Road. And sort of the assumption, it seems to me, is that it does exert influence, but there isn't much evidence of it. And as you indicate, rightly indicate in the report, and as you state that economic opportunity and people-to-people ties may go together, but Beijing's ability to convert public diplomacy inputs into realized influence is easier said than done. So it's kind of the language of power and influence, a little bit like I was having questions while I was reading the report. And once again, if we go to these cases of subnational communities, is kind of this aid to wash an exercise of power, or what is it? Or whether it's sort of something kind of part of something bigger. And public diplomacy to me is something bigger. It's not just about exercise of power, but it's linked to it in different ways. But well, you know better because you've been working on it much longer and in depth. I was also kind of wondering about the your working definition of the soft power, and it seems you primarily look at kind of language, culture, education, these areas, but well, it seems to me that the big part of the kind of soft power is actually the story of success that China has been having, and well, the latest being kind of the success in the managing the pandemic outbreak, which you actually mentioned in the report. So the kind of, I understand that you've already put so much stuff into your report, but kind of soft power is a bigger concept, and maybe a caveat can be put in, or somehow, I don't know. To me, I felt like there can be a bit more, done with that. And there are some good stories, but also some bad stories coming from China. And the kind of the Xinjiang story definitely had an effect on the public perceptions of China in the region, particularly in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. For me also, it seemed a bit exaggerated what you were writing about the kind of checking the influence of Russia and India in the region. It seems to me that China knows its niche, and I don't think it has the intention to dominate the region, particularly kind of squeezing the others and Russia out. And if we speak about India, there isn't much to actually to squeeze out. So that felt a little bit kind of not fully accurate to me. So it does seem to me that it's more kind of that the intention is to successfully integrate the region into the story of China's success and China's rise. The other point that I was also kind of thinking about is your kind of what you write about synchronization of kind of these different tools. And also later you were writing, for example, that China privileges financial diplomacy over soft power in Kazakhstan. And I was wondering, kind of how much strategizing actually goes into the implementation, the choice of implementation of these tools, and whether it was sort of conscious, yes, let's do financial diplomacy here, and kind of more of that and less of soft power. On financial diplomacy, that's the kind of really the super interesting part, and that's something I've really appreciated in your previous reports, kind of looking at it as part of the financial of the diplomacy. But at the same time, it's the kind of, and it does seem to be the strongest instrument, right, in Beijing's arsenal. But at the same time, I don't know how you kind of. First, the range is so big. Yeah, it's infrastructure investments. It's like reservicing of the debt, and so these things work differently. And how this kind of power works, it sort of works differently, with each instrument. And also, I thought that it would be difficult to it's difficult to assess the kind of the influence of these, because and quantify it. Because, for example, now there are less loans, less money, less kind of going to the region and to other regions, not only to Central Asia, because they want to kind of, for a number of reasons, but also they're working on kind of improving the quality of these investments, of these loans. So do we see the decrease in this kind of instrument or not? Because it seems to me that if China manages to improve the quality, it can do more, right? In terms of like for the sake of public diplomacy, the reputation will improve and so on and so forth. So to what extent is quantifiable, right? How do you assess that? And I'll stop here. but thank you so much for the report.
Sam, should we take Liz's question, or would you like to respond?
Sure, why don't we do Liz's question, and then we can do a round of responses.
I also have a few points to make. I really enjoyed the report, and I love the way you try to unpack the question of soft power and China's influence, which we talk about all the time, but often in such a general way that we don't usually know what the terms mean. And I think your report goes a long way to digging more deeply into that narrative and try to see, where exactly is China succeeding and where are the obstacles. But I do want to raise a number of points. So on the data, I've been looking in my own research at the Central Asia Barometer data, which is slightly different and shows greater soft power for the US and Russia greater than the US compared to China in the region. That's 2020 data. So I wonder, how your process differs from their survey. And I think also there's the overall context we should keep in mind that Pew has revealed about the overall decline in China's favorability worldwide. In most regions, with a few exceptions, Russia being one of them, but even there, China's favorability has been declining. And you make some interesting points about socialization and educational exchanges, and I just want to raise a question about that. On this panel, probably a lot of us have been involved in educational exchanges in China or in Russia and other places, and exposure and learning a language does not necessarily improve favorability. I mean, there have been a lot of studies about people who went to the Soviet Union to study Russia, and that did not, necessarily improve people's opinions of the Soviet Union. Usually was quite the opposite. And I think you would find similar experiences with China. So I don't know if we can equate the spread of Mandarin language institutions or exchangees with greater influence. And this brings me to historical factors. I think we need to bring those in. In my research, I've been looking at energy, water, and food in China's relations with Kazakhstan and Russia and Mongolia. And history is important because borders changed and resources were controlled by different states at different times. And so I think there are sovereignty concerns that underlie certain reactions to investments. And the point earlier about the different projects, I think applies. The different sectors might have different responses. Like water is a topic that creates a lot of unease in Kazakhstan because of China's upstream position, and that colors impressions of water-related infrastructure, for example, or agriculture. similarly, leasing of land is very negatively viewed. There are environmental consequences to China's projects that might inspire opposition. The use of Chinese workers, so the kind of the terms of the projects, not just debt or financing. I think there are a lot of related issues. And then also, I think we have to keep in mind that there are certain specific things that happen during a time span. Like my first time the first time I visited Kazakhstan was not long after Russia took over Crimea. And so I noticed there was a lot of concern about Russia at that moment. And now with the buildup in Ukraine again, we might see further concerns about Russia. However, as Nargis mentioned, there's the Xinjiang issue also. And so there are different specific things happening that at any juncture in time might affect the way people respond to a particular survey. And I think that context should be taken into account. And the final point I want to make is about the practice, how relations have a practical element. So I've been studying vaccine choices in Central Asia, which vaccines are used by which country. And even though you found that elites in Kazakhstan give China high marks for COVID diplomacy, the actual vaccine choice seems to be Sputnik V rather than Chinese vaccines in Kazakhstan. I mean, it's not true in every country, but and there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Kazakhstan, as far as I understand it. But those who are choosing to be vaccinated seem to have more reservations about Chinese vaccines than about Russian ones, for example, although there might be a preference for Western ones were they more available. So I think that people might generally feel China's talking a good line about COVID, but when it comes down to it, they may not feel comfortable taking a Chinese vaccine. So I think that the practice is, what do people actually do? What do their preferences illustrate about their views is the dimension to take into account. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Really helpful round of feedback from the panelists. I was scribbling furiously to play. I got most of the gist of that. Since I spoke first last time, I wanted to open it up to anyone on the team. If you'd like to jump in, signal to me. Otherwise, I can go ahead. All right. I'm not seeing any takers. So working backwards then, and if you guys change your mind, let me know. I think you're on the vaccines point, Liz. I think that's totally fair. And to be clear, the question we asked was not about the vaccine. It was a broader question about how countries are adapting a broader set of public diplomacy tools in light of COVID. And but I think you're right that, at the end of the day, the practical choices that people make, let us observe their preferences as opposed to just having us ask them subjectively about that. Now, there's probably more to it than just the vaccine choice, but I think that's a good, useful point to triangulate against and to kind of caveat what was said. On the historical factors, I mean, absolutely. I think, there's many different things that are happening between countries. In the last phase of this research, we did 6 in-country deep dives, qualitative interviews with people, and that was very much clearly coming out frequently, how much of people's attitudes towards foreign powers is shaped by bilateral events, as opposed to just, and sometimes it's global trends, but I think the bilateral events are very key. Interestingly, though, Xinjiang, even though it's been mentioned a few times today, is weirdly silent for a lot of countries in the region, and I've interviewed leaders and asked about this specifically, and a lot of the reaction I get is, well, you can't quote me on this, but what I would tell you is we can't afford to perturb China. So we have our own ways. Some people have said, well, we'll go around, behind the scenes and talk about China. Others say, well, we're just not going to go there. And it's because this is where the various tools working in tandem are important because, if you want to shape media narratives in a country, but you don't have any economic clout to back you up, why would a country deliberately, hold back on criticizing you for the way that you're handling your minority? So I think that's definitely important. I also think that, the points you raised about other factors that generate discord around projects are certainly something that we have seen as well in our research. The emphasis on Chinese labor, although it's interesting is you even see China adapting there. I don't think it hasn't taken Central Asia by storm yet, but one of the things we alluded to in the report is this interest in Luban workshops, which I kind of see as kind of an interesting sidestep for China in trying to sidestep past criticism of the overuse of imported Chinese labor. Obviously, there's a reason and rationale for why China wants to do that, but it's getting a lot more flack for it now. Well, if you can provide vocational training in partnership with local host institutions, train local laborers to work on these projects, but you're training them in your systems, your standards, your technologies, such that there is a nice spillover benefit for China. That seems like an interesting trade-off. Now, that's a stark contrast to the U.S. infrastructure bill that had Buy American clause. Doesn't seem like the U.S. is positioning itself rather well to take the higher ground on this. I think China's actually demonstrating a little bit more adaptability there. Point taken on socialization. Just to be clear, I am not indicating that, or the research team is not indicating that the act of studying abroad or engaging in exchange programs is tantamount to being co-opted by the Chinese government. But I think that from the perspective of strategy and how China employs certain tools, certainly there's the direct benefit of the revenues from this, also the prestige. But then there is a longstanding view, even in the U.S. and the early practices of, why emphasize Fulbright? Why emphasize scholarships? You're training the next generation of leaders. It doesn't mean that they are going to listen to you, but you hope that you build those networks, relationships, the familiarity. But you're right. I think we have to be careful to say China may have a particular intention. That doesn't mean that it actually comes to fruition. And I think that's similar to Nargis's point about when I talked about the desire to exert influence. That's different than China actually succeeded in exerting influence, right? And that's an important distinction, and I think you rightly alluded to that fact that, we can be coining this as, well, China wants to exert influence. They're using these various tools, but as we described, it's a lot more difficult to actually do in practice. The point you made on the strategizing, I actually got asked this question this morning from another panel. It's like the age-old question: does China have a strategy, or is it just opportunistic? And we talked a lot about fragmentation, across the different government agencies within China at multiple levels within China. Even the fact that BRI is notoriously vague, and Chinese scholars have said, well, that was purposeful on the part of Xi Jinping because he wanted something that had enough broad context, but people could fill in the lines a little bit in ways that shoehorn their own objectives, and that allowed them to get traction. I think we looked at the question of strategizing in two respects. One, in terms of China's stated rhetoric, in terms of how it talks about what it's trying to achieve with BRI, with its soft power push, but also, and Justin led the analysis on this. It's trying to look at this from the revealed priorities that arise when you take a step back and you actually analyze the distribution patterns of where China is focusing its efforts. What does that tell us about their revealed priorities? Whether or how that lines up to their stated priorities is a whole other thing. I think I have tackled a lot of these questions. There were a lot of them. I know that you all have a panel discussion you want to do as well. So maybe Christopher, I'll turn it back to you, but I'm happy to keep answering questions in the chat and as they come up.
Okay, thank you, Sam. So when we started off, there were 6 panel members. We're now down to 5. Marcin has left because he had something to take care of. So so far we've heard from Julie, Liz, and Nargis. I'd like to bring in Aigerim and Gatsitsa here. So regarding the topic of what's sometimes referred to as xenophobia or concerns regarding China's involvement in Kazakhstan. So Aigerim, you focus on Xinjiang human rights. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and then Gatsitsa, if you can talk a little bit about other issues in terms of concerns regarding China and how the bilateral relationship is managed between Kazakhstan and China regarding these issues that are sometimes referred to as xenophobia.
Hello, everyone. I hope you hear me well. First of all, thank you very much. It's an honor to join a panel with such a distinguished scholars. As you may know, I've been reporting on Xinjiang for quite a few years. And what I've seen is that definitely, as other panelists have already mentioned, the Xinjiang has definitely affected the public image of China among locals. If some, like from my personal experience, even if some local Kazakhs would never hear about the word Xinjiang, but after the months of activism work and reading articles about it from international and local media outlets, a lot of people have changed their perception of China, and some of the locals have been very vocal in supporting those ethnic Kazakhs and Uyghurs from Xinjiang who are living in Kazakhstan. I know that some civil society actors, for example, they've raised some campaigns to collect money to pay fines for the protesters, for example, in front of the Chinese consulate in Almaty, because it's been more than 300 days now since they started their protest in February this year. And they've been detained by Kazakh police, they've been arrested, and some of them were injured. And some of these protesters also said that the Kazakh police is cooperating with Chinese authorities. So there is nothing they can do to protect themselves, because Kazakh government, in a way, kind of on the side of Chinese government in this issue. So I think that there is some discrepancy in the society, that local population would be quite negative about the Chinese actions in Xinjiang, while the official line is still stable, that we're good friends, and what is happening in Xinjiang is China's internal issue. And this led to certain growing discontent. But I think with current global pandemic, people also have got other problems. And in general, the overall level of activism regarding Xinjiang has quieted down because of other factors that all of us, I guess, already know. Some of the leaders were arrested, and the organization was kind of divided into several parts, the activist organization. And for now, what I see as still a form of activism is the women from Xinjiang, particularly a bit older women who have their sons, daughters, or their relatives, husbands left in Xinjiang, and they're not able to reunite with them. It's their last kind of desperate form of activism is going to protest every day in front of the Chinese consulate in Almaty or Chinese embassy in the capital. And I've talked to these protesters myself, and it's a lot that they're doing. Like one of the protesters is a 67 years old grandmother, and she would go every day, take a taxi from her village to go to the city, to Almaty, to this protest. And she was detained, she was arrested, she was fined, she was taken by ambulance a few times because of different injuries or because she fainted. And there are some women like her as well that go almost every day to protest. And I think that it's kind of another form of resilience against both Chinese and Kazakh government. And we should pay attention to that as well, because these protests have been happening more than 300 days. And unfortunately, there wasn't so much of a public attention to it. We just hear the news that they were again detained or fined, but we don't hear more about their stories, what is driving them, and what are they hoping to get. Because, yeah, I mean, I don't know why, but there are some stories, but in general, maybe having more of such stories will kind of change a bit of a policy response. And also, we've seen that even this long protest still did not give any results. There was still no one coming from Chinese consulate, or no one from Kazakh government would give any clear answers about their relatives. We've seen some examples where some people have returned from Xinjiang, but this is only 1 or 2 cases. The majority of the people are still waiting for their relatives to come and be reunited. So yeah, I guess that's my point about Xinjiang.
Thank you, Igrim. And then, so I know, Gatiz, I was going to, so well, if you can, because I know that your co-authored article recently with Jeremy Garlick focuses on how elites view Eurasian Economic Union and Belt and Road. If this is a topic, if you'd rather answer that question or the issue of xenophobia, and maybe ranking the issues in order of importance, like Igrim before was talking about Xinjiang, is that the most salient issue in terms of accounting for conflict or tension with China, like other issues like the fear of Chinese owning land, the fear of Chinese men being involved with local women. So if you had to rank them in terms of order of importance, or you could either take that question, or regarding how Kazakhstan views BRI and Eurasian Economic Union, which I know you focused on with Jeremy Garlick.
Thank you, Chris. If you want to ask me whether Xinjiang affects somehow the Kazakh-China relations, I think that it will not affect anyway. I think that the state authorities in Kazakhstan, they had been kind of socialized by the Chinese normative power, meaning that China has already set its principles and norms as normal. And the state authorities of Kazakhstan, they're happy to adopt them. And it's mainly about shaping of interaction between two countries. It's now you can probably see that the state authorities have turned into pro-China agents, and now it's them who tout the success of Belt and Road that is based on such norms as balance, harmony, non-intervention, win-win, and so on. So there will be no other reaction of Kazakhstan state authorities on the Xinjiang issue, because they don't want to make China to feel uncomfortable about it. And second, what is interesting is that together with Professor Garlick, we made a discourse analysis, and we looked through the articles which had been published in Kazakhstan from 2013 to 2019. And it's interesting that the issue of xenophobia was mainly raised by the international media present in Kazakhstan. This is Radio Free Europe and only a few private media. And so you can see that the state-owned media, they do not bother about that issue, and neither they raised the transparency of investment contracts signed between Kazakhstan and China. So the coverage is most limited to Radio Free Europe because this is US finance media, and because human rights stay in focus of US interests, not of Kazakhstan. And I also spoke with elites in Astana, and it's interesting that nobody raised the big question. Out of 16 respondents, only one was sharing negative perception towards China, but the rest 15 were supporting China and supporting Belt and Road. And back to media discourse, it's probably interesting to note that there are 4 main reasons which media in Kazakhstan and the pundits highlight why xenophobia exists in Kazakhstan. So first, it is a part of historical memory. Second, it is a result of Soviet propaganda. Third, xenophobia is stirred up by West, by America and by Russia. And fourth reason is that xenophobia is raised by regional and regional clans and economic intelligentsia somewhere in regions. And it's interesting also to note that in media discourse, the historical narrative has been sort of reconsidered. Now media says that it was China who was helping the Kazakh Khanate to fight against Dzungars, and Russia was attacking. So they are actually positioning themselves together with China. I mean, this is a state propagated position of Kazakhstan in relations with China. And speaking about how Belt and Road and Greater Eurasian Partnership have been coordinated, and I made analysis of speech made by Eurasian officials, and at the beginning they considered these 2 projects as competitive projects, and if you pay attention to how Eurasian officials consider the Belt and Road, of course there was a kind of not clear understanding of how this coordination should be. And they actually, at the beginning, they clearly were saying that we don't want the focus to be on China, we rather should pull it on Russia. And after 2 years of consideration, they agreed that Belt and Road and Greater Eurasian Partnership is going to be about networks of trade agreements and not about transport and infrastructure. And they actually kind of relegated the Belt and Road into the status of technical part of Greater Eurasian Partnership. I think that in the long run, the Greater Eurasian Partnership will not be successful as a Belt and Road initiative. First of all, is about trade networks, and this is a very long perspective, and it's not clear with whom these integration is going to sign the trade agreements. Russia now is under sanctions, and most probably not every country wants to be a part of it. And second, I made a series of interviews with the elite in Moscow, in Astana, regarding this topic. And it's interesting that no one said anything positive about the Greater Eurasian Partnership or the Eurasian integration on itself. The respondents in Moscow, they were saying to me that it's just another project of Russia, and Russia wants just to support its imperial status in the region, and we do not take it seriously. And equally, the respondents in Astana, actually no one supported the idea of Greater Eurasian Partnership. So far, I think that the Belt and Road as a Chinese normative power, it has been more successful. So this is it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And for all members of the panel, if you'd like to respond to what anyone is saying, just raise your hand. We'll be happy to call on you. And Nursit, I know that there are a number of people who've asked questions in the chat box. So can you pose some of those questions to members of the panel?
Yeah, hello everyone. There are actually some 8 questions. Some of them were partially already answered, but this first one, let me just voice it because it was asked by an anonymous attendee. So the question I quote, as a social dimension, and maybe in general, does Xinjiang situation have an effect on Kazakhstan-China relations, as Kazakhstan is predominantly a Muslim state? I think this question was already tackled by Aigirian somehow, so maybe we should skip it. The next question, maybe we should ask Yelena Sadovska to answer it live, because her hand is in the air and the question is in the chat box. Can somebody enable Yelena to ask the question?
Yes, her microphone is on.
Yelena, please.
Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm very sorry. I caught cold and I can't talk properly. So therefore I asked this question in the Q&A session. Thank you for, sorry about that, and thank you for
Okay, I will read it out then.
Yeah, thanks.
So the question that Yelena posed is, could you please elaborate more on the sociological survey you conducted in the South and Central Asia countries? Is it Gallup's or your own? When was it conducted? What was the sampling methodology? Did you distinguish between attitudes in South versus Central Asian countries? So that's the questions. Whoever wants to answer it, maybe people from the AidData.
Sure, happy to do that. So Yelena, great question. So there were actually two surveys that we looked at, one of citizens and one of leaders. The citizen survey is the Gallup roll poll survey. We used their standard roll poll questions. Actually, Anna is on the call too and did lead this portion of the research. What I will say is that we looked at some subgroupings of countries, primarily on the basis of whether they received relatively more financial diplomacy versus some of the other types of soft power tools that we talked about. So we compared kind of what we called the extract countries, or the countries that were receiving a lot of this financial diplomacy versus other types. And then what we did as a double check, and Anna can provide more information if you like, but because the vast majority of those extract countries also happen to be Central Asian countries, we did a further robustness check on Central versus South Asia. So, but we did not report on those results in the survey in terms of looking at the sub-region by sub-region. We did the country level results in the report. For the leader survey, this is a survey that is run by AidData. It's a snap poll survey. So basically, since I think it's been now since 2014, we compile our own sampling frame internal to AidData. We do not use a kind of like a convenience sample that's often employed by market research. We identify essentially institution position maps. Is very technical, sorry, but essentially we try to identify the functions of the government agencies and the organizations that we think are relevant to the research questions we're trying to answer. Architect these as ideal type positions across government, civil society, the private sector, and then do a mapping exercise to identify the current relevant holders of those functions in different countries. And the reason why that matters is because the responsibilities for national planning may fall within the Ministry of Finance and Planning, or it might be a separate entity. And so our purpose of developing this mapping protocol is to be able to cross-reference across all of those different countries. We update the sampling frame every year. We do it systematically. I'd be happy to follow up with more information about how the sampling frame's constructed. It's actually pretty well documented and transparent. We try to do that. Unfortunately, given elite surveys, though, we don't get the volume of responses that really lend itself, at least for this one, it was only 13 countries. We didn't get the size response that we felt like we could break it down further than we did in the report and just providing a regional composite. But I think in future surveys and perhaps taking Julie up on her offer of maybe incorporating some similar questions to citizens and to elites, I think that could be kind of interesting and see what we could do in terms of breaking that down.
Thank you. There is one more question, and I quote George Kroll. The question is, does this report factor in the issue of corruption? And that is the possible use of bribes to decision makers to obtain favorable action on Chinese projects. So that's the question from George Kroll.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the issue of corruption is certainly something that we've looked at in the past. This is the second in a two-part series for looking at South and Central Asia. We primarily, in the first phase of this work, actually did extensive key informant interviews on the ground in 6 South and Central Asian countries, and prior to that, 3 East Asian and Pacific countries. Certainly corruption comes up. It's interesting. It's one that comes up anecdotally, very specific to specific projects. So we heard examples in the past that were indicative of the types of procurement processes that these Chinese-backed finance, the Chinese financing of projects entails, which is often closed door. They're not open procurement processes, and so sometimes anytime you have opaque processes, it doesn't matter who the actor is, right? Anytime you have that, there's opportunities for co-optation. and that's often what people will report on, is to say you could have that in terms of who is selected, and kind of marking up the bid to get a kickback to a local government official. We've also heard examples of this in terms of progress on projects. So there are often in these agreements for implementation expectations that the government, or if the government is too slow in granting permissions, for progress to move forward, that they will pay a penalty to the implementer. And so we've heard examples of implementers and government agencies colluding to purposefully gum up the implementation process so they can claim the penalty and split the proceeds. But the challenge with these things is that there are these like individual examples. It's much more difficult to track that systematically. We certainly know it's definitely a perception of the issue. I think that would be the next great challenge, I think, to try to actually follow that systematically and capture how many of these projects are exposed to corruption. And how does that vary compared to corruption that could, encroach on anybody's financial project?
Thank you, Samantha. And there is one more question about the future of the BRI, which is actually an interesting one. So I quote anonymous attendee, what would you suggest if BRI would be done in the near future? What market should we adopt or develop to expand Kazakhstan's economy? Now, world gradually is transferring to a green economy, and Kazakhstan surely will face a deficit of budget because the budget is mainly being fueled by oil. That's why, what market should we take into account? This is an open-ended question. Anyone?
Anyone on the panel, feel free to respond to that.
Apparently it's a question from somebody in Kazakhstan. Okay, I'm going to ask another question then.
We have one person who asked on several occasions to ask a question via the call. That's Amanala Kashgari. I'm going to allow her to talk. Your microphone is on.
Great. Thank you for this opportunity. Can you guys hear me clearly? I just want to confirm that first. Great. Thank you. And first and foremost, I think, this is a report that I'm definitely looking forward to read, and definitely would like to dive in further into every single aspect that you guys have conveyed. And the previous speakers have asked a lot of interesting questions, which I have wrote down as well. So thank you for providing those answers. And at the same time, I wanted to, cover a point that is not mentioned. What I mean by that is this. We know that 30 years of Kazakhstan, whether it's from the USSR area until now, there is a particular political process, not just Kazakhstan, but all Central Asian countries are going through currently, which is decolonization process. Even though Kazakhstan has been an independent country, it was an overnight process, and whether it's the government structure or education board and etc. is really not prepared for that. And I believe Kazakhstan especially is doing a good job in not getting ready, but at least progressing forward in its own decolonization process. And what I mean by decolonization process is rediscovery or recovery of their own identity, mourning of what has happened in historical territory of Kazakhstan now. Gaziza mentioned about the relationship with Jungaria or with the Manchu Empire and etc., for example. And then also dreaming of their own future prosperity of their nation, and also commitment and action, whether commitment to the region or to the international community, and clear action in regards to become a major influence in the region itself. And by conveying that, what I was trying to focus on is this particular issue, which was mentioned, which is you guys been calling it Xinjiang, but I call it East Turkestan. I hope you guys will respect that. In regards to the situation in East Turkestan with the current genocide and gross human rights violation that's been carried out by the Chinese regime. And in regards to Kazakhstan authority or the Kazakhstan people's perspective on that, we definitely see because of the genocide and gross human rights violation, rediscovery and recovery of identity is actually moving in a speed that is positive. What I mean by that is this: a lot of Uyghurs who are Kazakhstani citizens, or as I call it, Kazakhstani Uyghurs, for example, they know that they're not living abroad. For example, I was raised in the West.
I'm sorry, can you get to your question? Because we do have a lot of people left. Can you just get to your questions? Sorry.
Okay, got it. I'll just finish my sentence and then I'll get to the question, if it's okay. So I know that many people don't see Kazakhstan as a foreign country, but an area that we naturally belong historically as well with the Kazakhs and other Turkic people. So my question is this: I know the report has focused on US, India versus China, Russia as an entity. There is a particular power and influencer that wasn't really focused on, which is Turkey. With the creation of the Turkic state organization, I believe that's some area that really going to play into the dreaming and commitment aspect of that decolonization process of Kazakhstan. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Sam, did you want to? Oh, go ahead.
Sure, real briefly. Yeah, I think really interesting point on Turkey. I think that's come up in some of our field research as well, and in a conversation I had this morning. I think that would be one to include moving forward. I think the difficulty, particularly with the status quo survey polls and tools that we can often use, is getting polls that consistently ask questions about the set of powers that you're interested in a comparative lens. We even struggled with India a little bit on this one. The data was much spottier for that. I imagine Turkey will be another challenge, but I think asking questions about that, I think that could be interesting. Also from the perspective of, do they seem to take on kind of an entirely different approach to public diplomacy? Do they mirror or mimic, what China and Russia are doing? Do they mirror or mimic what they see the US and UK having done in the past? It'd be interesting to see, if you start to group these different powers in terms of their overall approach to public diplomacy. That could be really interesting.
And so, Sam, we only have 4 minutes left, correct?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
Chris,
Okay,
maybe you
so
should
maybe-
ask, excuse me, Chris, there is a Sergei Grigoriev who wants to ask a question, and his hand has been in for a good hour.
Okay, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you for, first of all, I have to say, like, I really appreciate your work. Like, it was done really good. So my question is that actually I have two questions, and since we have really time, like just not enough time, so my question is that you can see in the chat, even if you just will have troubles with listening. So my question is one more. So as I mentioned in chat, like what would suggest if BRI would be done in the future? What market should we adopt or develop to expand the Kazakhstan's economy? And like for now, we have noticed that there is agency when a world is turning out to another orientation, to be exactly to the green economy. And like there are some states which is reluctant to use like these fossil fuels. And if you remember Kazakhstan, surely we the Kazakhstan's budget is being mainly fueled by oil. So of course Kazakhstan will face with a deficit of budget. And so finally, what would be your final suggestion? What market should we take into account in order to expand our economy capability? So that's it.
Would any members of the panel like to take that question?
I can try to say something about that. I think that's a really important question, and it speaks to what China's role with the BRI is going to be in the region. Is it reinforcing the fossil fuel economy, or is China going to use its capacities in renewables like wind and solar to provide a new path forward? So far, I mean, that's the angle that I've been looking at, and so far I see the former, where China's been offshoring some of its more polluting technologies, investing in coal. China claims it's not going to be doing that in the future, so we'll have to see. And there are other players like the EU, Japan, hopefully the United States, that can try to work with Kazakhstan in this shift. But I think that's a really important question that bears further research.
Okay, and unfortunately, we are approaching 9 o'clock. I would just like to say thank you to AidData and to all the panel members here for agreeing to participate in this. We could certainly go on much longer. Any panel members' final comments regarding the state of affairs between China and Kazakhstan, or anything that was raised so far? Sam, would you like to say anything, or?
Sure. Yeah. The only thing, I mean, there were lots of good food for thought, I think, from the discussion, the interventions from the panelists and the participants, always good food for thought. One of the things that I feel like we kind of have touched on in this conversation, and it came up again this morning, and I would like to spend a little bit more time looking at it and maybe reach out to some of you, but this question about how Xinjiang fits in. So a lot of the questions here have come up in terms of Kazakhstan's perceptions of China, with regard to the Xinjiang issue. One of the questions that came up this morning was about how Xinjiang fits into China's public diplomacy strategy, if you will. And one of the interesting things that some of us observed when we were getting into some of the subnational data were some interesting trends that we tried to model out, and it didn't actually tell us what we had hoped. Can't make data do what you wanted to do, alas. But just interesting anecdotal evidence of the amount of sister cities, the amount of international education hubs in the Xinjiang region connecting to Central Asia. And one of the rationales that scholars have posed for this and practitioners have posed for this is that it's a potential to kill two birds with one stone. You're advancing your public diplomacy overtures overseas, but the idea of being able to quell unrest in Xinjiang through introducing new revenues from international students, new economic cooperation, new development. It's an interesting idea. And to look at that a little bit more systematically, both from Central Asia looking into China and then from China looking outward, could be quite interesting to see if we could actually pinpoint, is this just kind of sort of happening, but it's not intentional? Is there a strategy behind it? What does this mean for Xinjiang? What does this mean for perceptions that Central Asian countries have? I think that'd be interesting. But other than that, random aside, thank you so much for your time and attention for the report. I found the panel discussion really interesting. This question of xenophobia and whether and how that might be a hurdle for PRC influence and what that means in terms of Russia's ability to sustain its power and presence, I think is a really important one. So lovely to hear all of your takes on that. And we hope that you'll stay in touch and continue to read the report and use the data and do something great and new and additional with it.
Okay, thank you everyone for being on the panel. Thank you to our audience for attending this event.